I was on the run. It was not going well. The car I had stolen to make my getaway had run out of gas. I'd left it by the side of the road and been trying to hitch a ride for hours, but no one was stopping. And now the sun was setting. It would be cold soon and dark, and there was no way I wanted to spend the night out in the open. I looked around. The city I had fled was a dark, jagged shape on the horizon. The road in front of me stretched for miles in both directions. There were no diners, no gas stops that I could see. I continued to turn and saw the high-rise in the distance. I tried to work out how far away it was and figured a mile, maybe 2. I tried to work out how far away it was and figured a mile, maybe 2. If I headed there, I could trick my way in or break in, then find a place to sleep. As far as options went, it was the pits, but I did not know what else I could do, so I set off walking. It was dark by the time I reached my destination. The high-rise stood on its own and was surrounded by rubble. I figured there had been other buildings here once, but they'd all been demolished, leaving the bleak edifice that I was staring up at. There were no lights on in the windows that I could make out, which made me think the place was deserted and was probably due to be knocked down as well soon. I smiled. Breaking into a derelict building was going to be a piece of cake. Still grinning, I walked around until I found an entrance. I gave the door an exploratory push, and my good fortune continued when it swung open. I was in. The air smelt stale and I couldn't see much, so I tapped the flashlight on my phone and moved the beam around. A rat caught in the light stared back at me. I almost dropped the phone in shock. The rat turned its back on me and walked away. It took its time. There was only one of us who'd been scared by this unexpected encounter. "Yeah, you better get out of here," I told its tail, just before it slipped out of sight through a gap in the doors of the elevator. There were no lights showing above the doors, and I doubted the elevator had worked for a long time. Which was not a problem. I was not looking for penthouse accommodation. A space on the ground floor where I could get a few hours rest was all I needed. I continued playing the flashlight along the walls until I saw a sign with what must have been apartment numbers on them. Getting warmer, I thought, and headed that way. I found myself in a narrow corridor lined by doors. The first one would not budge. The next one I tried creaked and opened part of the way. Holding the flashlight in front of me, I squeezed through the gap and exclaimed, "Yes!" I was in a small, dusty, smelly room with a sofa in it. I sat down on the sofa and sighed with relief. I found somewhere to sleep. If someone had told me at the start of the day that I'd be so pleased to find a dirty piece of furniture, I would have laughed at them. But that was before I had tried to rip off a dealer and found myself running for my life. And I'd made it. I had survived. I stretched out on the sofa, closed my eyes, and fell into a deep sleep. I woke, blinking in the light streaming through a window, and feeling groggy. I had no idea where I was for a few moments, and then it all came back to me. I hadn't had much of a life to throw away. I had been a chancer, a loner who'd been surviving as best as I could since I was a teenager. Then I'd got greedy, seen a way to make some serious money. It had all gone wrong. The dealer I had crossed had people everywhere, and I was a dead man if I ever went back to the city. I cursed my stupidity, then sat up. I had to put all that behind me now. First things first, I decided. I needed to find something to eat and drink. My stomach was cramping and my mouth felt parched. My nerves had been too raw the day before for me to even think about food or drink. Suddenly, they were all that mattered. I rolled off the sofa and began to look around the apartment I was in for something, anything. There was nothing in the cupboards in the cramped kitchen, though, apart from dust and scattering spiders. I slammed the cupboard doors closed in frustration and left. I kicked the next door further along the hallway open and searched another grimy apartment, Once more, I turned up a blank. It wasn't till the next apartment that I struck pay dirt, in the shape of a can. There was no label on it, so I had no idea what was inside, but that did not put me off. I rooted through the kitchen drawers and punched the air in triumph like someone who just won the lottery. I took out the can opener I had found and worked around the edge of the can. There was some kind of stew inside it. I did not hesitate, did not even think if I was about to give myself food poisoning. I shoveled the mulch into my mouth using my fingers. After demolishing most of the contents of the can, I ran my finger around the inside to scoop up every last bit. Then I leaned back against the wall and tried to catch my breath. I actually laughed as well. Hunger had sent me a little bit crazy, but I was fine now I had eaten. I wiped my hands across my lips and thought, shit, what now? I could traipse miles back to the road where I'd been the day before and try and hitch a ride again. Or I could head in another direction and see where that took me. I took out my phone to open up a map to see what might be close, but the signal bars were flat. And worse, the battery was close to dead. I turned the phone off to save what little juice was left. The idea of walking blind was not wise, and the chance of catching a ride felt slim at best, so I needed another plan. Nothing sprang to mind immediately, so rather than just standing there scratching my butt, I decided the best thing to do was look around some more of the abandoned apartment block. I might find some useful things, maybe even stuff I could take to a pawn shop when I eventually made it back to civilization. Feeling hopeful, I put the can opener in my back pocket and set off. I worked my way around the rest of the ground floor apartments that I could force my way into without too much effort. There was more old furniture, chairs and beds and chests of drawers, all on their last legs. There were plates and pans, old newspapers and magazines, and empty picture frames. But there was nothing of any use to me. I decided to check out a couple of apartments on the first floor, and if there was nothing in them either, I would call it a day and take my chances back at the roadside after all. With the elevator being a no-go, I used the stairwell. In the daylight, I noticed how my sneakers were leaving marks in the dust which covered the treads. I did not notice the spider's web stretched out all the way across the stairwell until I walked through it, and I was still brushing away strands of web and scowling when I reached the first floor. The second apartment I went into on this floor delivered. There were 3 cans in the kitchen and a miniature bottle of Scotch whiskey. It looked like the type of thing a tourist would buy. I opened it and toasted the empty apartment, then drank the bottle in 2 gulps. It was fantastic. The whiskey drained, I settled into a battered armchair in the front room and opened the cans. The labels had all come off them at some point, so it was a lucky dip once again. I found I had fruit, tomato soup, and chunks of steak and gravy. I wasn't so keen on the thought of the steak, but the fruit and tomato soup went down very nicely. Feeling slightly hazy from the booze and full from the fruit and soup, I carried on exploring. The rest of the first floor proved to be a dusty treasure trove. I collected a dozen cans, which I put in a suitcase with wheels and a handle that I found in the back of a wardrobe. I also found a pocket watch, which I thought might be worth something as an antique, and a necklace. This was lying on the floor in a bathroom, and its clasp was broken. I wondered if the person who'd owned it had even realized it had fallen off before they'd left the apartment for the last time. Well, their loss was my gain. I put the necklace with the pocket watch in a compartment in the suitcase for safekeeping, then dragged it up to the second floor. Up to now, the only sounds I'd heard were the occasional scurrying and scratching noises in the dark corners from what I assumed were more rats. But as I stepped out onto the second floor, a new sound made me stop in my tracks. Music was drifting out from one of the apartments. It was very simple, nothing more really than a few tinkling notes. I followed the sound to another open door and looked inside the apartment. A young woman was sitting cross-legged on the floor. She looked about my age, maybe a couple of years older. Her hair was matted and the dress she wore looked as if it had not been washed in a long time. There was also a small music box on the floor in front of her. It was brightly colored and there was a tiny key in one side. All the woman's attention seemed to be on the music box, and she hadn't noticed me. As I stood there gawking, wondering what to do, the plain tune played by the music box slowed and then stopped. I held my breath, and the woman glanced up and saw me. She looked startled and scooped the music box up as she jumped to her feet. I held my hands out and said, "I'm sorry I scared you." She stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. "I won't hurt you," I said. "It's okay." I got why I was freaking her out. We were in a derelict building in the middle of nowhere, and I was a strange man. I thought the best thing I could do was to back away, to show her that I was not a threat. As I retreated into the corridor, she suddenly moved, running out of the room and away into the stairwell. In a matter of seconds, she was gone. I did not follow. I just stood there, my hands still held out. "It's all fine," I said to myself. "All fine." Encountering the woman had left me feeling shook up, so I cautiously looked in a few more apartments for a comfortable place to sit down. One of them had a big armchair with a footrest. I settled into it and tried to chill. As my nerves settled, I started to wonder who the woman was. She looked kind of feral. If she'd been living in the abandoned apartment block for a while and scavenging, that would explain her appearance. I shook my head and laughed to myself again. This was the strangest place. With a wry smile still on my face, I dragged myself to my feet and set off to see what other surprises the building held. The third floor provided me with a baseball cap that had been fashionable 5 years before, some more cans, and a walking cane with a fancy silver-plated handle. Pleased with my haul, I carried on up to the fourth floor. Pulling my suitcase along behind me with one hand and holding the walking cane in the other, I walked out onto the latest corridor. I went through the first open door I saw and froze in my tracks. A man sat upright in an old-fashioned wooden armchair. He had not moved for a very long time, and, unlike the last person I had encountered, he would not be running away from me. His skin was gray and shriveled, his eyes dull, sightless orbs. I felt bile rise into the back of my throat as I realized the dark patches on his face and hands were ragged holes in his skin. I turned around and left the corpse to its grotesque peace. Back out in the corridor, I paused for a moment, then pushed the door closed with my foot. I was not sure why, it just felt like the right thing to do. After my close encounter of the gruesome kind, I decided to give the remainder of the fourth floor a miss and headed back up the stairs. Over the hours that followed, I covered a dozen more floors, and my suitcase began to bulge at the seams. One more floor, I told myself, then I'd rest up and figure out my next move. I walked out onto the 19th floor and into the first room I came to. Then I put my hands up and said, "Don't shoot." The man pointing both barrels at me was shaven-headed and looked like he meant business. The woman next to him was cradling a baby. I gulped. I had no idea who these people were, but one thing was clear. I was the intruder here. "I don't want any trouble," I said. My words did not seem to have any effect on the man. He continued to glare at me with a cold, hard expression in his eyes, and there was not even a hint of a shake in the finger curled around the trigger. The woman seemed to be studying me, considering. Then she turned to the man and said, "Put that down, Brad. Can't you see he's just a scared kid?" The man, Brad, glanced at her, then lowered the barrels. He still did not look happy, but it appeared the immediate threat to my life was over. I was so relieved. I threw up. I'm so sorry, I said afterwards. The man and the woman just looked at me. Then he said in a deadpan voice, "This is why we don't have house guests." And they both burst into laughter. The baby in the woman's arms gurgled along happily. I was left there once again, shaking my head in bemusement and with a confused smile on my face. The room we were in was full of old books and blankets and towels and cushions. Cans were stacked against every wall. My gross addition lay on the floor. Still chuckling, the man picked up a towel and threw it to me. "Once you've wiped that up, throw the towel out the window. The littering laws around here are pretty lax, so don't worry about getting a fine." I grinned at him, starting to feel more at ease thanks to his sharp sense of humor. "Will do," I said. "And sorry again for puking in your apartment." "No problem," he replied. "I'm Brad, as you know. This is Jenna, and that little bundle of joy is Annabelle." I was totally out of my depth when it came to small talk about family things, but I managed to say, "Your daughter is happy. I mean, she seems very smiley." Brad smiled at this and said, "She is a ray of sunshine, but she is not my daughter. I used to be a neighbor of Jenna back when the apartment block was a regular place to live. Then the eviction started so the developers could clear this land and build a new complex, a mall complete with cinema and all the usual junk that no one really needs. But best as I could find out, the developers went bust, so this place was left standing and we stayed on. Two stubborn souls. And it seemed natural to move in together, especially when Annabelle came into the world." As the truth sunk in, I gaped at the woman and her baby and said, "You gave birth here, in this derelict high-rise." She looked down and the love on her face for the baby shone out. "I did, and thanks to Brad, everything was fine." She kissed the baby on the forehead, then looked back at me. "We know we can't stay here forever, but we have plenty of food stockpiled and a little money, and Brad set up a filtration system for the rainwater, so we have clean water." She turned to Brad, and tough-looking though the man was, I swear he blushed a little. Then he looked at me, shrugged, and said, "I used to be in the army. A lot of things they taught me have proved real helpful here." I smiled and said, "They clearly have, and the shotgun apart, it's been a pleasure to meet you, but I'll be on my way now. I'm just passing through." Then I cleaned up the mess I had made, disposed of the towel through the window as Brad had suggested, and left. "Take care of yourself now," Jenna called out after me. "Yes, ma'am," I replied and headed back for the stairwell. Through the windows, I could see the first traces of sunset in the sky. It was time to find somewhere to sleep. And I decided I did want to try a bit of penthouse living, even if the penthouse was derelict. I set off up the stairwell and before too long reached the top floor, where I walked out into a scene from a nightmare. Bodies hung upside down in a line extending the length of the corridor. They appeared to be held in place by long claws extending from their bare feet which pierced the ceiling. Their arms were crossed across their chests, and each had another single claw where their thumb should have been. The nearest of the bodies to me was a man. His skin was very pale, and his eyes were closed, but his chest was moving in shallow breaths. I had no way to be sure, but my gut instinct told me he was in some kind of trance. I was horrified and fascinated, and, careful not to brush against any of them, made my way down the line. Each of them appeared to me to be lost in a dark place, deep inside themselves. At the end of the line, the last door off the corridor was partly open. I was drawn towards it. I could not help myself. I pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. Through the broken glass of a window, the growing darkness of the new night crept across the floor. The young woman I had encountered earlier was crouched in a corner. She was cradling the now silent music box on her lap and staring up at me. I was wound up so tight I felt as if I could barely breathe, but I had to know. I had to understand the mystery into which I had stumbled. "What are they? Those things out there?" I asked, my voice hoarse and uncertain. "Not everyone who used to live here left," she replied. "Some were brought here and changed into the creatures you see." "Who brought them here? Who did this to them?" I was shaking as I asked this. "The Dark Lord," she answered. "He chose them to be his servants, and they wait now for his return. As do I." When she said these last words, I could tell she was hurting inside. "But you're not one of them," I said, still trying to understand. She shook her head, and her voice was quiet and small when she said, "The Dark Lord would not take me because my blood was bad." She held up her arms, and even in the gloom I could see the track marks on her skin. Her eyes shining with tears, she went on, "But I have not used since the Dark Lord rejected me, and now, when he returns, he will want me." My mind was racing. Everything I had learned had left me feeling as if I was at the edge of a precipice. If I fell, I would be consumed by insanity and fear. I had to get away. I took a deep breath and left. Keeping my back pressed against the wall, I inched my way along the corridor and into the stairwell. My legs felt like the bones had been removed and were about to give way at any moment. But by leaning on the walking cane, I made it down a few floors and stumbled into a room. I was suddenly exhausted by my ordeal and lay on the floor. Sleep descended on me the moment I closed my eyes. The next thing I knew, I was blinking and shielding my eyes from the bright light streaming in through the window. I got up, brushed off dust, and peered outside. The sun was high in the sky, and I realized I must have actually slept for ages. Well, I was not going to hang around a moment longer. It was time to leave the apartment block and take my chances back in the outside world. But as I was walking down the stairwell and passing by the turning to Brad and Jenna's floor, I heard the baby crying. It was so loud. I hesitated. I felt a flicker of concern, so headed along to their apartment and stuck my head around the door. Brad was pacing up and down. Jenna held the baby. It looked very red and was continuing to holler at the top of its lungs. Is everything okay?" I asked. Brad shook his head. "Annabelle is sick. She's running a dangerous fever. She needs medicine, but the nearest pharmacists are in the city. I'd have to walk there, but by the time I got back..." He couldn't finish and put his head in his hands. He looked close to tears. But what could I do? Then it struck me. "I had a car," I told him. "I could go back and get it and drive to the pharmacist for you." Then I remembered why this wouldn't work and added, but the car ran out of gas, and I don't have any money to pay for the medicine." So much for my bright idea. I was useless. But Brad was looking at me with hope in his eyes. "I have a canister of gas in my stockpile, more than enough to get you there and back, and I'll give you the money." A few minutes later, I left my suitcase and walking cane on the floor and was hurrying down the stairwell, carrying a canister of gas, cash, and a handwritten note with the names of a couple of medicines that were safe for infants and could be bought over the counter. It felt like it took forever for me to cover the distance on foot back to where I had left the car, and the closer I got, the more worried I became that something would have happened to it. It might have been towed or trashed, and then I'd be stuck while Annabelle's fever continued to rise. By the time I got to the car, I was coated in sweat and hugely relieved that it was still there and in one piece. After emptying the canister, I started the engine and was soon back on the road, heading to the city where I was a marked man. I have to admit that, at that moment in time, I considered turning around and heading in the opposite direction. I had a full tank and a handful of dollars. I could have been in a new place where no one knew me in a few hours. I could start again. But I had spent my entire adult life looking after number one, and it had brought me nothing but trouble. I was on a different path now. I floored the accelerator and sped on, towards the city. I saw a sign for a pharmacy not long after reaching the outskirts. The dealer's influence spread far and wide throughout the city, but hopefully I could do what I need to do on the edge of his territory without being seen. Hoping the odds were in my favor, I turned off the main strip and started looking out for the pharmacy. This did not take long. It was a shabby place on a street corner, with a burnt-out car opposite and a couple of shady characters sitting on a tenement steps nearby. I almost kept driving, thinking I'd be better finding a pharmacy in a nicer neighborhood, but the clock was ticking. I parked up and hurried inside. There was a queue, and as I waited, I felt like every single person in there checked me out at least once. I told myself I was being stupid, paranoid. Even so, I was mighty relieved when I got to the counter. They had one of the medicines written on the note, and I had just enough cash. I did not wait for the change. I put the small bottle of medicine in my pocket and ran from the pharmacy. Back outside, I climbed into the car and sped away. I did not look back as the miles flew by. Just beyond where I had originally ditched the car, I found a turning which looked like it would take me close to the high-rise. There were no signs and the road had fallen into disrepair. I did not slow down, even though the suspension felt like it was being battered by the surface of the road, and jolts of pain kept traveling up my spine. Finally, the high-rise neared. The sky was darkening again, and the shadow of the towering building was lengthening over the wasteland. Still, it was a welcome sight. I couldn't get all the way to the high-rise because of the rubble, but after pulling up and jumping out of the car, I only had a short sprint till I was there. I could be up the stairwell and handing over the medicine in next to no time, I thought to myself triumphantly. I was almost at the entrance when I heard the roar of engines. Feeling sick in the pit of my stomach, I looked around. 2 cars were racing toward the high-rise. They were close enough for me to recognize the people in the front seats. They worked for the dealer. They were his enforcers. Stone cold killers. The cars careered to a halt. The back doors flew open and more men I recognized from the past I thought I was escaping rushed out. Then the drivers and the men in the passenger seats joined them. I cursed my lousy luck. I must have been seen at the pharmacist's, and the lightning-quick network of the streets had meant these vicious thugs were on my trail by the time I drove away from the pharmacist's. I just hadn't seen them till it was too late. I snapped out of my shock and ran into the high-rise. I needed to get the medicine to Brad and Jenna as soon as I could, but I must not lead the thugs to them. These vicious scum knew no mercy. Not knowing what else to do, I began to race up the stairwell. Seconds later, I heard the door being kicked open below me and shouting voices. I kept running. Threats echoed up through the winding space of the stairwell. My lungs burnt and my vision blurred. No matter how hard I pushed myself, though, my pursuers were not falling behind. The sound of their footsteps clattering on the stairs was painfully close. I took 2, 3 steps at once. I was desperate to escape, but I had reached the end of the stairwell. I was at the top floor. I glanced down. My pursuers would appear at any moment. I swore and ran out into the corridor. The bodies hung unmoving before me. I did not hesitate. I raced past them, accidentally catching some with my flailing hands. Their skin where I touched them was cold and hard. It felt inhuman, more dead than alive. Behind me, I heard my pursuers bursting into the corridor. I was almost at the end of the line by then, pushing past the body of a woman, and I glanced back at my pursuers. They were crowded together looking at the bizarre spectacle, illuminating the bodies with the flashlights on their phones. One of them exclaimed, "What is this freak show?" Another one of them shouted in response, "Looks like target practice to me." As I watched, he drew and aimed at the first body. The sound of the discharge filled the corridor, and for a moment there was silence. Then the body that had been shot began to scream. A piercing, sickening screech. As if they were somehow connected and each had felt the burning agony of the bullet entering the flesh, the rest of the bodies began to scream. As the woman next to me screamed, I saw the fangs in her mouth, the lines of spittle hanging down from them. I recoiled in horror and staggered on, until I reached the end of the line, the last apartment on the corridor. I almost fell through the door. The young woman was standing in the darkness that now shrouded the room. I could just make out the shocked expression on her face. "I'm sorry," I gasped as I moved towards her. I did not mean to." I couldn't go on. I'd led my pursuers to her. And now they were here, moving into the room. The flashlights on their phones cut lines through the gloom. "We got you now, boy," one of them muttered. "Gonna make you pay for what you done," another growled. I could just about see the cruel smiles on their faces. They were enjoying this. I knew it was over for me, but none of this was the young woman's fault. "Take me," I said, "but leave the girl. It's nothing to do with her." They laughed at this, dismissing my pleas with cold, cruel indifference. "You got no say in this, boy," one of them said. "We'll take what we want when we've finished with you." Then he stepped forwards, and I caught a glimpse of the knife he held. He pointed it at me, said, "Game over." The words were barely out of his mouth when I heard a strange sound of sharp, rapid movement. It was coming from outside, from beyond the broken window. I span round and saw a dark shape speeding towards us. It crashed through the window and landed on the floor. I could make out vast wings folding over the back of a crouched figure. The cold scent of the night filled the room, and no one spoke. Then a flashlight crossed the room, its beam shaking as one of my pursuers tried to see what was happening. The figure rose, and its face was revealed in the light. Its eyes were hooded voids, its nose flat against its face. Its skin was deathly pale and translucent. The dark veins beneath were exposed. Its lips were narrow strips of flesh, opening now to show its fangs. They were long, curved blades. Hideous, and yet somehow beautiful. We had all stood transfixed by this vision of terror, but now the young woman bowed. "My dark lord," she said. It turned to her, and a smile showed on its hideous lips. Then its gaze moved to my pursuers, and it said in a voice that was raw and distorted, "You hurt my servants. I heard their cries, and I came. And now you will pay." It stepped forwards, towards them. They backed away, turned to flee. But the Dark Lord's servants had been awakened. They crouched low on their feet, bared their hideous teeth, and attacked. The Dark Lord stood and watched. I could not. I turned away, tried to cover my ears as the men who had pursued me screamed. Then silence fell. I could feel my heartbeat pulsing inside me, tasted bile in the back of my throat. My pursuers were no more. But what of me? Would the creatures turn on me now? I dared not move, dared not look. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. A gentle touch. I looked up. It was the young woman. She smiled at me. "They will not hurt you," she said. "They can sense that you meant them no harm, and they wish only to be with the Dark Lord now." I looked around at the creatures. Their faces were stained with blood, and they were gathering round the winged figure. "You should go now," the young woman said. I took a deep breath and told her, "Come with me. Leave this horror behind. I need to make sure the baby gets its medicine, but then I'm going to the car. I can drive us away from here." She shook her head and walked away from me, towards the creatures and their Dark Lord. She reached out to it, and it extended its wings, enveloped her slender form. As it did so, she brushed away her hair, exposing her neck. The Dark Lord bit. It granted her darkest wish. It made her a vampire.